Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this very exciting event. We have some excellent speakers lined up today, and we're just going to wait a few moments before we begin. And while we wait, why don't folks take this time to type in the chat where in the world you are viewing this webinar from? All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for this exciting event. This webinar, which is titled Myths and Facts About Genocide, What's Happening in Xinjiang, China, is a highly anticipated discussion, to say the least. This is because there are both shocking claims about what's happening in Xinjiang, with very little on-the-ground reporting on the issue. There is massive confusion as well as curiosity around what is actually happening. My name is Sheila Xiao. I am your host for today's webinar, and I am an LA-based activist, researcher, and co-founder of Pivot to Peace. Joining us today is a panel of speakers to help guide our understanding around what's going on. Our speakers today are Daniel Dumbrill, a YouTuber based in China and Hong Kong. Daniel recently hosted a panel discussion on Xinjiang that went viral, which is a testament to the need for this continued discussion. He also recently visited Xinjiang as well. Kenneth Hammond, a professor in East Asian Studies and Global History. He is also the author From Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History. Ken has lived and still teaches regularly in China. And finally, we have retired Judge Julie Tang. Julie Tang was born and raised in Hong Kong. She came to the United States in her late teens, and she was educated at the University of San Francisco, Stanford University, and UC Hastings College of the Law. Upon getting her law degree in 1982, Judge Tang worked as an assistant district attorney in San Francisco, and in 1990, she was elected to be a judge in San Francisco. Upon her retirement from her judgeship in 2014, she co-founded two peace organizations, the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and Pivot to Peace. Our organization, Pivot to Peace, was formed 18 months ago in order to educate and mobilize public opinion in the United States about the decisions taken by the Pentagon to identify major power conflict, meaning conflict, especially with China, as the top priority for Pentagon military preparations, for military planning, for budgeting and war plans. At the same time, as the Pentagon took this momentous step, the Trump administration and almost all of the mainstream media in the United States began a systematic effort to demonize China and to create animosity, fear, and hatred against China among the American people. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that the direct result of this campaign is the ever-growing rise in brutal anti-Asian violence in both the United States and Canada. And this is precisely what happened prior to other American military campaigns and wars. Evidence and facts were thrown overboard, while lies and propaganda were presented as absolutely true. And because they were repeated over and over again, they became accepted as a given truth. They were accepted almost as an article of faith, and in other words, a belief that did not require any facts or any evidence. The Trump administration launched an economic war against China. The Trump Department of Justice arrested Chief Financial Officer of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, when she landed in Canada. American companies were told to cut trade and economic links with Chinese counterparts. And all of this happened without a real debate about the wisdom of this new orientation with China. Instead, they were presented hysterical stories about how China was evil, that it was oppressing national and religious minorities, that China was destroying democracy in Hong Kong. And we are told that all of these campaigns were designed to present the new policy of confrontation as a policy designed not for war, but rather to defend human rights. And these campaigns are continuing under the Biden administration. And this is the reason why we wanted to hold today's webinar. The Biden administration has continued a very dangerous path of misinformation where facts and real investigative journalism are sidelined for sensationalized headlines. Virtually every mainstream news media headline around China is designed to echo a specific narrative about China. And these days, we are bombarded with claims about what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, which is an autonomous region in the northwestern part of China. The claims now have amounted to the unspeakable claim of genocide against a minority people. And Secretary of State Anthony Blinken vows to punish China for these so-called violations of human rights. But what are the facts? Is China actually carrying out a genocide against this minority Muslim population? Or is this one more demonization campaign waged by the US government against a targeted country in preparation for confrontation? After all, the US did insist that Saddam Hussein was a threat to world peace because Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and used that rationale to justify war against Iraq. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and that war that took more than 1 million lives was based on lies. So today's discussion will help us explore these questions. And now I'd like to introduce Daniel Dumbrill, who is joining us actually from China. Daniel, you recently visited Xinjiang and spoke to all kinds of locals from the area and documented a lot of this on your personal YouTube page. And you've been doing a lot of work to uncover what is actually happening. I think the audience is eager to hear your remarks around this issue. So thank you so much for speaking with us and joining us today. I'll pass over the mic to you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks for that intro, and thanks for having me here today. Definitely, I made a trip recently to Xinjiang and started to post some things on my YouTube channel for everybody to see. There's a bunch of other stuff coming as well, and other experiences that would probably come out in a conversation format like this. Now, for today, I was originally planning on speaking about that recent trip to Xinjiang and talking about the things I saw. It was a great trip. I got to see a lot and speak to many people on my own. I spoke to not only people who had positive things to say, but also negative things about China and the government. But I found myself getting a bit burnt out. When you go to Xinjiang looking for evidence of a genocide and approaching it this way, eventually you get to a point where, to be frank, you start feeling like an idiot. When I went to Xinjiang, I didn't want to go in with any sort of a bias. I wanted to see if I could find something that perhaps I had not been looking for. I wanted to see something, I wanted to see the situation from the perspective of somebody who really believes there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang. And to accomplish that best, I reached out to multiple anti-China voices, one of whom could probably be considered one of the top 10 loudest voices on this matter. I won't mention his name because we did agree to keep our private conversations confidential, but I collected information from them on what to look for, what to ask for, where to go, asking for specific coordinates as well, and took a look at Xinjiang from their perspective. At first, it was interesting to try and look at my surroundings from their perspective. And after a certain point, as I said, you start to feel like an idiot. Take, for example, being asked to check a children's bookstore, because apparently I won't find any Uyghur children's books. Not only did I find a wide selection of Uyghur children's books, and even a Uyghur translation of Henry Kissinger's book in the grown-up section, but if I wanted Chinese, simplified Chinese or English children's books, I had to go up to the second floor in a far-off corner to find them. I decided to film the children's book section, the Uyghur children's book section, and the Uyghur staff started shouting at me and saying, I'm not allowed to film. And I asked, is this some sort of a government rule? To which they replied, no, this is our bookstore rule. We don't want our competition having our layout and all of our book details. And I explained that I'm not from Kashgar and that there are rumors overseas that Uyghur children's books are not allowed, that they're banned. After the staff gave me a strange look, they said, okay, fine, in a way that seemed to express, okay, buddy, whatever you say, probably whispering to each other after, that these foreigners are really strange, reconfirming my feeling that I was acting like an idiot. The next step after graduating from feeling interested to feeling like an idiot was anger. When you start to meet ordinary locals and you realize that many of them have a small plot of family village land where they grow cotton. And when you hear stories of women whose family status increased and leverage in the family, especially in abusive relationships, their status went up because of their opportunities to work and improve their own personal quality of life. You suddenly start to realize after you hear these stories that the U.S. isn't out to help these people. They're out to destroy them. Their sanctions are designed to do what sanctions were always designed to do, and what they've almost always accomplished: make ordinary people on the ground suffer and feel discontent. Couple that with America's delisting of ETIM as a terrorist organization, which is allowing them to raise funds and recruit now, and the very obvious fact that recruitment in an environment of unemployment is far easier, as was observed in many other places, especially with Al-Qaeda's recruitment drive in Iraq after it was destabilized. To me, it's obvious what they're trying to do. This is exactly why there's a desperate attempt to sanction as many products as possible from Xinjiang or factories who hire Uyghur. Not because there's any actual solid evidence to support the forced or slave labor claims, but because they want to destroy the economies that Uyghurs rely on and scare other companies in China out of hiring Uyghur workers, fearing accusations that they'll receive. This is done to undo China's progress in its most important successes they achieved in their anti-terrorism efforts. America's out to do the same thing they did in the last Cold War, try to achieve their geopolitical goals through terrorism. Destroying Xinjiang's progress and pushing locals back into poverty is not an unfortunate consequence. It's the actual target. While discussing his book, The Art of Sanctions, Richard Nephew admitted that sanctions were designed to destroy economies and specifically mentioned to drive up unemployment in the regions of target. Richard now works with President Biden. I'm still glad that I reached out to these anti-China personalities to take this approach. I'm a firm believer in the idea of deliberately seeking out information to prove your own conclusions or positions wrong. And that's what I want to briefly focus on here, especially because so many people have firmly made up their minds already. And therefore, many of those people wouldn't even believe a single thing I said about what I experienced in Xinjiang anyways. In reality, what should really be going on, rather than having people continually trying to debunk outrageous claims, is the people making those claims should be expected to provide compelling evidence to prove it. But we're just not seeing that. This is why when the US State Department lawyers were pushed on the topic, they were forced to admit there's no evidence to support the idea of a genocide in Xinjiang. And this is why the International Criminal Court doesn't feel the evidence is sufficient either. They probably see the circular nature of so much of this evidence. For example, creating the claim that the Uyghur population is being genocided through birth control. The first step is to get a witness testimony, no matter how filled with contradictions and critical holes, to say that they were forcefully sterilized, or more accurately, had removable IUD placements forced on them. Next is to create a deliberately misleading translation or translations of Chinese documents to look like family planning efforts targeted minorities more than anyone else, and added in a few creative assumptions. A quick side note, some of those testimonies actually even put Neria's fake 1990 testimony used to promote war to shame. Everyone also overlooks that many of these witnesses are posing with East Turkestan flags, problematic and revealing for a number of reasons that I won't get into today. Anyway, thereafter, they search in a selective way for specific data that wouldn't normally support the idea of genocide anywhere else, but now they decide it does, because this is what they're hoping to find. They, for example, grab official Chinese government birth statistics and say, look at that remarkable drop. When someone points out that's fairly characteristic, a characteristic drop in any rapidly developing society, or say, as a matter of fact, even Japan had a bigger drop than that in the 80s during their economic ascent, they reject what these drops have always meant in favor of what they're hoping to say it means. So now the data must mean genocide because it lines up with the narratives, and now the narratives must be true because the data has been twisted to say so. Both of these, both the shoddy narrative and the shoddy interpretation of the data sets mean nothing on its own, but for some reason, when combined, it creates a compelling enough story to declare genocide. But what I'd like to do now is encourage people to take the same approach that I did, and I think we should all do on any topic. Actively seek out evidence to prove your own position wrong. Don't continually seek to prove your own bias correct. Look for red flags and ask yourself critical questions. What I'll simply do from this point here is pose a few questions to you. You may be able to find the answers to them, but I want to give you, or you may already know some of the answers to them, but I want to give you an idea about some of the questions you should be asking yourself in order to help create a framework or a point of view to work from. I will offer some of my own answers, but you can look for your own as well, of course. I'll also add in some context about the overall big picture by highlighting some of those red flags I said you should be looking for. First of all, let's look at this with motive in mind. Is there a motive to genocide the Uyghurs? If it's to erase their culture, they seem to be doing a lot of counterproductive things, from language support, celebrating their culture on national stages, and so on and so on. There's been no national attempt to villainize this group like we've seen in actual real historical genocides. Even compare that to Israel, where the hatred between groups is palpable, and perhaps worth noting has more evidence of atrocities in a single week than we've had for years of focus on Xinjiang, even with millions of dollars poured into the narrative. Challenging all these different possible obscure motives that anyone could come up with isn't something I'm going to do now. Once again, I just want to point you in the right direction. Let me ask a much simpler question, one where the answer is exceedingly obvious, at least from my point of view. For this, we've got to follow the money, and the money is overwhelmingly coming from one specific place. With that in mind, does America, the #1 state funder of the Xinjiang genocide narrative, have a motive to fabricate these stories? Well, yes, absolutely, without any doubt. China's rise is something that threatens the US for so many reasons. It threatens their global hegemony. It threatens the US dollar as the world's global currency, something that America gains a lot of power from. And it threatens their brutal hold over the global South countries that America has terrorized and exploited for over 100 years. This is no longer about just attacking a single country in the Middle East with fabricated lies for the purpose of maintaining control over a single region, like we all know they do. This is now about maintaining control over the entire world. So imagine how much more effort is going to be put into this. This is also exactly why the plan for $300 million per year in anti-China propaganda targeting the Belt and Road Initiative was recently put forward. America wants to derail China and convince the world that China is so unethical, no one should work with them. And it's an important part of America's manic and panicked scramble to remain #1. Ask yourself, if this is all fabricated, why Xinjiang? To me, the answer is pretty obvious for this one too. It's located in the key doorway for China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's a place that had social unrest and terrorism issues that could easily be exploited. And the US attempts in Hong Kong already flopped, but they certainly tried hard by supporting the rioters and even sending over US senators to walk around in the streets and encourage them. This literally happened, which, by the way, you don't have to imagine too hard what the reaction would be if Chinese Communist Party leaders did the same thing in reverse when the Capitol Hill riots were going on. All right, so we have a clear motive and an opportunity here. Does America actually lie, though? Do they create fake human rights atrocities for their own selfish geopolitical interests? Do they also manage to trick and convince most of the rest of the world as well? Well, yes, of course, absolutely. Remember that example of the Niura testimony I gave you? That's just one of many. You can go through the other obvious ones, like the weapons of mass destruction, the dishwashing powder that Colin Powell held up at the UN and said was anthrax, and the list of false flag attacks that go on and on. We've even actually already exposed lies in relation to China. Declassified documents showed that when the US government said China was interfering in the most recent set of US elections, it was completely fabricated. There was no evidence of this. Do you think the US is suddenly going to stop lying now, both in a general sense and more specifically in relation to China? I mean, no, of course not. This is just starting to heat up. Does the American government truly care about human rights abuses? From a big picture point of view, on an international scale? No, not really, especially not when it's them or their allies committing those abuses. This is exactly why America says they'd like the world to follow rules-based order, carefully avoiding the words international law. In a rules-based world, they make the rules and other people follow them. So we've established that America has the motive, the means through funding, the opportunity, and a clear track record of doing this kind of stuff. They've been caught over and over again doing this stuff. Does this mean human rights abuses aren't happening in Xinjiang? America's clear benefit from getting people to believe this story doesn't automatically make it untrue. However, their involvement, combined with a lack of real physical evidence, despite generous funding, is important context to understand the big picture and stay alert. Sometimes America's geopolitical interests do line up with real human rights issues, but understanding the dynamics at play here, remembering how many times you've been tricked with similar narratives before, and understanding the criminal nature of the American government's foreign policy is extremely important context. People often criticize me for talking about the American government so much, but this is absolutely relevant. If there was someone fabricating this narrative with malicious intent, America is the prime suspect here. We should absolutely be looking at them and remembering the lessons of yesterday in terms of what it means when America suddenly cares this much about human rights abuses, and especially when we consider that the funding for this narrative has America's name all over it. People are willing to say, sometimes people are willing to say, well, you know what, we don't really have evidence of genocide here, but it sounds like something China would do. So let's just assume it's true for the time being. Well, with that logic in mind, you'd be even more justified to say we should probably assume America is lying through their teeth yet again. Some people overlook this because they believe preventing China's rise is something that is necessary, so necessary that they're willing to engage in intellectual dishonesty and believe in something that might not really be true in order to accomplish a greater good. At least get yourself to a point where you can admit to yourself that this is what's going on. It's a baby step towards recognizing that the reason you felt comfortable with your intellectual dishonesty in the first place is also because of a second layer of propaganda. The Chinese government has never acted or expressed quite like America has, that they want to dominate the entire world, as you've been led to believe. Despite your belief that all superpowers act the same, we have enough information to see from China's current and past actions, they will not go around overthrowing governments like America does. They don't talk about their superior political and economic system quite like America constantly does either, who often even pushes their way onto the world by military force. But this is getting a little off topic. I'm just trying to illustrate that when it comes to China, you are buried under layers and layers of propaganda. Try to break free from this. You've had enough lessons about what happens when you're uncritical of Western state-sponsored narratives. You allow yourself to be fooled over and over again, acting just as surprised each time, and yet still returning to a, well, maybe they're telling the truth this time, state of sleep yet again. Let's take this first step, though. Recognize that there's a reason for concern with the narrative, regardless of how you feel about China. Put that aside for the purposes of intellectual honesty and self-respect for just a moment. I'm telling you now, if you do this in an honest way, you're going to be blown away by what you find on every China-related topic, from the Hong Kong protests to the Sri Lanka port propaganda, to the groups behind the organ harvesting stories, to the groups training Uyghur children in Syria with military equipment, and of course, to the true story of Xinjiang. You'll suddenly wonder why, in what's being painted as a Holocaust of epic scale, you were so uncritical about the fact that there's no refugee crisis, and the few people that escaped, who are being propped up by American politicians as survivors of the Chinese concentration camps, were there, where they were, brutally beaten and tortured and escaped genocide and escaped China on their passports, legally exiting through China exit customs and immigration. You're not going to be able to fully comprehend how ridiculous this is until we get past that first step I've been talking about. There's a whole world of information that your bias has shut you off from, and a whole world of perspective to better understand some of the recent reactions from China as well, in events like the Alaska meeting, for example, and beyond. I'm not going to give away much more than this, and you shouldn't listen to me anyways. When you go on this journey on your own, when you discover this stuff on your own, it's so much more fascinating, valuable, and rewarding to the entire way you think about these issues and narratives in the future. And in the process, it's far more useful in order to better equip yourself to avoid being fooled again, no matter what the topic ends up being. In closing, I want to say, if all of this isn't motive enough to take a couple of steps back, even for just a few moments, in order to take a look at what's happening around you, consider what happened with your complacency in previous American-led propaganda campaigns. Maybe some people don't really care because the consequences were for innocent people on the other side of the world that they don't know and they've never met. They didn't know their names then and they don't know their names now. But we're in a whole different ball game here today, though. Look at the language being used by America and its allies, especially Australia. Look at what they've been promoting and look at what they've been doing. We're getting closer and closer to requiring one small spark to set off something that will have consequences for all of us this time. And thank you for listening. That's it for me.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for your extremely illuminating remarks. I think your explanation, especially of the geopolitical and the economic context, really helps people who don't really know about the issue, who really don't know anything about what's going on from a wider lens, right? You begin to see the patterns of these claims of human rights violations really as a precursor to war. And I think the last point you made of think about really the casualties of war, the human lives that are at stake. And also really appreciate the questions you pose to the audience and hope that folks do take those questions seriously and explore those answers with a critical analysis.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. Is just take a step back, because the propaganda that's coming out is kind of like whack-a-mole. A new claim comes up and you can only debunk so many of them, and many of them have been debunked. So the better thing for people to do is just to take a step back and start asking critical questions, I believe. So yeah.
Exactly. No, thank you so much. So next, I'd like to turn the mic over to Ken Hammond. Ken, I think we can consider you the China expert on this panel. You've not only lived and taught in China, but you also have a very popular course on China called From Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History. And jumping off of what we heard Daniel speak about, can you just tell us a little bit more about what exactly is going on in Xinjiang? And also, people outside of China generally are unaware of what Chinese policies look like around ethnic minorities. Can you tell us about those policies, what those policies are and how those relate to the Uyghur population.
Sure, I'd be, of course, I'm delighted to be here tonight and be part of this conversation. And I have to say, Daniel, that was a wonderful discussion and a very much needed sort of sense of maintaining a critical distance on what we're told, what we're presented with in the media and coming out of the mouths of politicians and things like that. You mentioned early on that experience of going into the bookstore in Xinjiang, where you'd been told that, you know, there were going to be no children's books in Uyghur, and then finding the shelves full of those. That reminded me very much of the first time that I traveled to Tibet, which was back in the 1990s, and had been told many times that, of course, you know, it was illegal to possess a picture of the Dalai Lama, and that you should never take anything like that with you because you could get in all this kind of trouble. And when I arrived in Lhasa and went down to the Jokang and the Barkor, the central temple and the market around that, there were pictures of the Dalai Lama being sold in stalls, you know, right there on the street. And so this was just one of those moments of cognitive dissonance. And it just sounded very much like your experience in the bookstore. But yeah, what I would like to do just for a bit here is as Daniel just suggested, is step back a minute and think about what have been the realities, what have been the experiences of ethnic minorities in China, and particularly in Xinjiang. And so I want to talk a little bit very briefly about kind of the larger historical background. This is what you get when you bring historians in, but also about what is the basic package of policies? What's the policy orientation of the government of the People's Republic towards ethnic minorities? And how has that played out over the last 70 plus years of history? And then look more specifically at some of the particular issues out in Xinjiang itself. The People's Republic of China, of course, was founded in 1949. And in a sense, you know, talking about international law and sort of the conventional ways in which political entities exist and interact in the world, it became the inheritor, if you will, of the previous state of play in China, which would have been the Republic of China, which itself, having come into being back in 1912, was the inheritor of the Qing dynasty, the last of the imperial dynasties. And it's very important to understand the Qing dynasty because that was a multi-ethnic state, a state in which the Han Chinese people were certainly the vast majority, but it was composed of many other ethnic groups. The ruling elite were non-Han people, the Manchus. They partnered with Mongols and Tibetans and Uyghurs and others, and shared a large territorial space with the Han Chinese, and governed that in a way that took into account the particular conditions of many different ethnic communities. The course of 20th century history, the first half of the 20th century for China, of course, is very tumultuous, and we don't need to try to go through all that. But when the People's Republic is established, they have to come to terms with that reality, with that space, that geographic space, the boundaries that had been established by the Qing dynasty, inherited by the Republic, and then became the boundaries of the People's Republic. And that included areas in which non-Han ethnic communities were majority populations, including specifically Xinjiang in the far western part of China. But there were also many other ethnic communities scattered throughout the geographic space of China. There are 56 recognized ethnic identities in China, one of which, the Han, are the vast majority. The other 55 constitute, at this point in time, about 7 or 8% of the overall population. So none of them very large in themselves, but in the aggregate, you know, a significant proportion of the population, of the citizenry of the People's Republic. And you know, we get into some sort of linguistic confusion because, of course, we talk about China, we talk about the People's Republic. And sometimes there's a sense that when people talk about being Chinese today in the People's Republic, that's still an ethnic identity. But to be Chinese today, to be a citizen of the People's Republic of China, doesn't designate a particular ethnicity. All the different ethnic communities are part of that political community. Okay, so that's one thing to bear in mind. But there's still the question, which was faced by the new government in the 1950s, of how do you deal with these distinct ethnic communities. And the policy package that gets put together by the Chinese government operates on kind of two tracks. And I want to take a minute to think about what those two tracks are and why they're important, why it's important to understand that there are these two. Excuse me. Because on the one hand, there's a commitment to respect and preserve the traditional identities, the traditional cultures, if you will, of these various ethnic communities. And here we should say that some of these communities, there are tens of millions of people, the Zhuang people down in southwestern China. There are perhaps 35 million people who can be identified as Zhuang. Uyghurs in Central Asia, in Xinjiang, are about 10 million. Tibetans, maybe 5 or 6 million. These are relatively large groups. Some of the ethnic communities are quite small, perhaps only a few tens of thousands of people. But in all of these instances, there's a policy commitment on the part of the new government, and this has been carried on down throughout the last 70 plus years, to respect and preserve these traditional cultures, these traditional communities, and senses of identity. And that means things like honoring language, preserving the spoken languages, or if they have them, written languages. Of these communities. Education to be carried on in the language spoken by the people of these different ethnicities in their communities. Traditional customs, traditional music, traditional dress, other kinds of cultural traditions. Religion, honoring, respecting many different religions. Not all the ethnic minorities in China share a particular religion. Of course, Tibetans are Buddhist, Uyghurs are Muslim. Some of the communities in the Southwest or in various other parts of China are more traditionally animist. Some are not particularly religious in one way or another. But whatever they may be, those religious traditions, those spiritual traditions are honored as well. And so there's that sense of trying to allow people to preserve and protect and keep intact these traditional cultural systems. But there's another side, there's another dimension to all this that's very important to understand, and that is a sense of or a desire for inclusion and opportunity. And what I mean by this is that the idea isn't to take a particular ethnic group and say, like, for example, the Dai people who live down in Yunnan province in the southwest near the borders with Laos and Myanmar. The idea isn't to say, okay, we're going to take these people and we're going to put them in a little enclave. We're going to put them in a little preservation pod, and they're just going to stay the way they've always been. We're going to set them aside, and we're just going to keep them as a kind of cultural curiosity. That's not what it's about. You want to respect and preserve, honor their tradition, but inclusion and opportunity means China is a developing country. China is a country undergoing tremendous change, tremendous economic change. The material conditions of life have changed in amazing ways since liberation in 1949. Life expectancy has grown. Infant mortality has dropped. Opportunities for education, opportunities in employment, many different ways in which China has been a rapidly developing society. We all know, we all hear, even with the anti-China propaganda, we hear so much about, economic development, economic growth in China. And of course, anyone with any direct experience of China at all, if you've seen life in the cities, the towns, the villages of China, you know that there's been tremendous change in the course of the history of the PRC. The policies of preserving tradition should not mean and have not meant that ethnic minority peoples are excluded from that development, from that progress, from that change. Instead, in combination with the desire to preserve and protect these distinctive identities, is a desire to create opportunities for people from these communities to be a part of the overall growth of China. And this is the kind of thing that we see, especially, being sort of twisted when we look at a situation such as Xinjiang. Now, this gets all of these ideals, all of these goals get implemented in very practical ways. It was mentioned, Daniel mentioned, that Xinjiang is what's called an autonomous region. Under the Constitution of the People's Republic, geographic areas, administrative territories, within which a particular ethnic community constitutes a majority or a very significant proportion of the population, can be designated as autonomous regions, which is a province level unit, like sort of the equivalent of a state in the United States, or prefectures or counties or townships even, all the way up and down the administrative hierarchy. There are autonomous entities. And indeed, Xinjiang itself, we hear a lot about the Uyghurs. We hear about the Uyghurs, which are the largest of the ethnic communities in Xinjiang, but by no means the only one. There are Tajiks and Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, a number of other generally Muslim communities, Islamic communities. The Tajiks, though, for example, speak Iranian-type languages, whereas the Uyghurs and others speak Turkic languages. So there's a range of variety there as well. So each of these areas, each of these autonomous areas, has special administrative policies and practices, and that has often meant that the ethnic minority communities have been exempt from some policies that were applied elsewhere in China. For example, in Tibet back in the 1950s, while land reform was being carried on throughout the rest of China, Tibet was exempted from land reform. All of the ethnic minority communities were exempted, for example, from the one-child policies while those were in effect, which meant, as a very practical demonstration, that the aggregate percentage of ethnic minority communities within China went from 5 or 6% up to now 7 or 8%. So because the Han population was being kept in check, the proportion of non-Han peoples increased. Okay, which also, of course, sort of problematizes the idea that some sort of genocidal policies are being practiced against ethnic minorities. The ethnic minority communities also have been the targets, I suppose you could say, of what we might think of what here in the United States we would call affirmative action programs, educational opportunities, vocational training opportunities, different kinds of ways in which members, young people, especially from ethnic minority groupings, could be given special consideration to be brought into more mainstream positions in terms of education, in terms of job opportunities and things like that. Now, when we look at the particularities of Xinjiang, that gets into some of these charges that are made. We hear, Daniel did a good job of talking about, kind of the absurdity of these claims of genocide. And I just want to say that, of course, the term genocide is such an emotionally loaded term. And for Americans, for ordinary Americans, we hear the term genocide, and with all the associations with, of course, the Holocaust in World War II, the emotional appeal of that term is very powerful. And the propagandists who utilize it, who deploy it, they understand that. They understand that that's going to appeal to the better nature of Americans. Of course, we have a sympathetic response. We're like, oh my gosh, genocide. How terrible. But when we look at the realities, we see that they're not substantiated, and it's just that. It's a propagandistic effort at moralistic sort of manipulation, which is not to say that the relationship between the government of the People's Republic of China and the ethnic communities, especially in Xinjiang, is entirely frictionless, is entirely, we don't want to portray it as a great big group hug love fest. Certainly there are going to be differences of opinion. There are going to be, problems sometimes in policy implementation and things like that. But to suggest that these things rise to the level of something that could in any way be characterized as genocide just goes against all, not only the formal policies, but all the practical experience that we can actually document in China's relationship with its minority cultures. And this is reflected in the attitudes that people have in Xinjiang. Even, we're not talking here about, what does the Chinese government tell us about the attitudes of people in Xinjiang, but even Western public opinion surveys, studies like the Ash Foundation at Harvard study of public opinion in China, which includes areas, includes Xinjiang, includes Tibet, includes these areas that are sometimes problematized in Western accounts, where there's clearly overwhelming support for the central government, for the policies of that government, for the opportunities, for the inclusion that is being carried out. I want to talk just a little bit about some specific issues, some specific policies, some things that get talked about or get portrayed about Xinjiang. Of course, we've all heard the stories that at least a million, maybe millions of Uyghurs have been rounded up and placed in detention camps. Well, this is clearly not true. This is one of those things that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute likes to put out satellite photos of buildings in Xinjiang and claim that these are detention camps when they're actually investigated, when you go and look at them, when outside independent observers have verified these. They've been government offices or schools or apartment complexes. It's a very problematic thing. But in general, that idea has been pretty thoroughly debunked. But there are actually programs run by the government in Xinjiang through which a number of people, in some instances, very large numbers of people, have passed. Okay, but there are basically two kinds of programs, and it's important that we understand this and that we separate one from the other. There have been in Xinjiang political elements that wish to separate the province, separate the region from the rest of China, and to create there an Islamic state. There was briefly, back in the 1930s, something called the East Turkestan Republic, which was an Islamic fundamentalist state, which of course banned education for women and their appearance in public without veils and things like that, which wanted to enforce the Sharia law, things like that. And there are elements in Xinjiang that wish to revive that or create some other new kind of Islamic state there. And those elements have, on occasion, engaged in terrorist activities, bombings, attacks on police stations, seizure of weapons, not just in Xinjiang, but elsewhere, even in the capital, in Beijing. Buses have been blown up in other parts of the country, attacks on travelers at train stations, things like this. So there have been real security concerns. One of the programmatic responses to that has been efforts to, as it's put, de-radicalize, especially younger people in Xinjiang, younger people from the various Islamic ethnic communities, not just Uyghurs, but others as well. That's a relatively small program in terms of the overall numbers of people, maybe tens of thousands of people going through that, or maybe as much as 100,000 people going through that, nowhere near the same scale. And of course, that's stretched out over long periods of time. But such programs exist in which people are, there's political education, there's talk about, why this kind of violence, why this kind of radicalism is not good, is not defensible, is not supportable. So those programs do exist. And of course, programs like that exist in Western countries as well. This kind of terrorist violence is not something that a government that cares for the safety and security of its people is going to, really be eager to tolerate. But the much larger programs in Xinjiang have been, as the Chinese government says, these are vocational programs. This gets dismissed, of course, as just propaganda claims in the Western media for the most part, but even the New York Times had to admit in an article about a year ago that 485,000 people who had passed through these programs were at that point employed in various occupations, and we're not talking about picking cotton in the fields, although some people obviously do that. But in places like the Volkswagen factory outside of Urumqi. Volkswagen, of course, has issued public reports about its employment, its effort to include people from the Uyghur population in its employment pool, in its recruitment pool. This is part of the side of the ethnic policies of inclusion and opportunity. So for people to go through these, let's say that 1 million Uyghurs have gone through vocational training programs. This isn't a matter of rounding people up and putting them into a camp behind barbed wire, but it is a matter of people going through government-sponsored programs where they perhaps live in dormitories and take classes, and then they go out and, maybe 500,000 of them have gotten jobs and are working, and this was a year ago, I imagine the numbers are greater than that now, working in gainful employment in the modernizing sectors of the economy. This is the kind of opportunity and inclusion that is a goal of government policy. Starkly in contrast, one might say, with the marginalization and discrimination of a system such as we have in the United States, where Native Americans are basically confined to reservations where economic conditions and public health are pretty minimal. Trying to bring people from the ethnic communities into the mainstream seems to me to be a much more positive and creative way to deal with all this. Of course, Daniel, as I say earlier, talked a lot about the genocide claims and talked about, for example, the lack of refugees, the hand-picked spokespeople who legally exited China without having to, somehow escape in some great dramatic way. Their accounts, funded by, supported by things like the National Education for or Endowment for Democracy and other semi-clandestine American government operations. Those stories notwithstanding, there's simply very, very little, really no indication substantively of anything that could by any means be defined as genocide by any normal, rational application of that term. Daniel also mentioned this question of the birth rate, the idea that the decline, and it is a documented statistical decline in the birth rate amongst minority women. The idea seems to be on the part of people who hold this up as a claim of genocide that minority women couldn't possibly be making a choice to reduce their childbearing. That kind of reduction is a standard feature. It's called, demographers call it the demographic transition that we see in modernizing societies from Europe in the 19th century on down around the world to the present day. And of course, China itself, in the recent, the new statistics that are coming out from the more recent census, the birth rate in China itself has dramatically dropped. There's some people expressing concern that the Chinese population itself is going to start shrinking. So, to sort of portray this, to take this idea that there's been a drop in the birth rate amongst young Uyghur women as an indication of some sort of coerced policy on the part of the government goes against what is the much more reasonable and rational and self-evident explanation that it's simply a response to better opportunities, better economic conditions, better education, and better agency, enhanced agency for Uyghur women as they become part of a modernizing overall society. So I think that when we look at China's policies and we look at China's practices, we see a reality. We see both a commitment and a lot of follow through on that commitment to both preserve and protect community identities, and at the same time to provide opportunities for people from minority communities to be part of China's overall growth. It is, of course, that overall growth, the flourishing, the increasing prosperity of China, China's emergence once again in the world as a significant economic force that is perceived by some in the United States, by the established power elites in the United States, as a threat. But their choice to try to demonize China, to try to characterize China's policies towards, a significant minority of its populations as genocidal, as oppressive, this simply doesn't coincide with the realities both of political commitment and policy by the government and of the experience of people on the ground, living their lives, their improving lives in China today. So I'll let it go at that and turn it back to you, Sheila.
Thank you so much, Ken. I certainly learned a great deal from everything that you just talked about, and especially appreciate the context that you made about this confusion around what's going on with Uyghur women, and really just the natural trend that happens when there's economic development for women and the encouragement of women to enter the workforce. Again, thank you very much for those educational remarks. And the actual policies around ethnic groups in China, while not perfect, it certainly seems much more intentional than anything I've seen here in the US, where people have to struggle every day really hard for basic rights for ethnic minorities here in the US, which are consequently being threatened every single day, even by the government. So thank you so much, Ken. I wanted to see if Daniel, you had anything to add to Ken's remarks.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a lot of really great context for people to understand. I mean, talking about the birth rates also, following up on that, imagining that, we just went through one of the largest, most epic poverty alleviation programs the earth has ever seen. And we know what happens when people's standard of living goes up. Birth rates go down. Now, if you want to compare the ethnic minority birth rates to Han Chinese, you also have to understand that a lot of ethnic minorities who weren't restricted by the one-child policy like Han Chinese were, oftentimes, especially on the outskirts, were having 6, even 10 kids. So when the birth rates go down because the entire economy, the entire society has been elevated, there isn't much room for Han Chinese to go down more. They're already restricted to one child. So again, these are about asking these logical questions. I like that Ken also brought up the Ash Institute, Ash Center from Harvard University, the study showing how much support is enjoyed in China. And that's not only across Han Chinese, that's across the ethnic minorities. I can give you a personal example also, even in a case where you would think it wouldn't be true. So I have a very close friend of Kazakh ethnic minority from Xinjiang. And he told me about some of the things when local policies were being implemented during these kinds of anti-terrorism attempts. And some of the ways the local governments decided to implement them were very insulting. There were things that he had a very good reason to be angry about. It's nothing like what people are saying in the West. I didn't get his permission to share his story. So I'll just say that it was something worth being angry about. But even with that, there was one time he was sharing a story with me of this this American woman who speaks Uyghur very, very well. And he was showing me videos of her, like she was playing Uyghur instruments and speaking Uyghur, what he said was even better than many Uyghurs could. And he was so excited to show me this. And I said, I saw her. She was on a panel acting as a translator for one of the witness testimonies. It was Tursane. She's on the 3rd version of her story. And apparently her passport was renewed while she was under arrest. It's a completely fake story, but very obviously to me at least. But she's being propped up. She was propped up by CNN, BBC. And now she went on these panels with the American government to prop up her story even more. And he was so shocked. He was like, oh no, don't tell me that she's anti-China. So he cared. He still is very supportive of his government, and he still is really really dislikes this anti-China propaganda, even though he had some conflicts on the ground with local government officials. I think, talking about the terrorism problem also is really important too. And you don't have to look too far to see what these people were trying to accomplish in Xinjiang, because you can just look to Syria, because a lot of them are in Syria, and you can see what's happening in the towns that they've taken over. So I'd say that, it was really, really good. Lots of good context. I like that.
Thank you, Daniel. Any final comments, Ken, before we turn it over to Julie?
No, I think that I'm very anxious to hear what Julie has to say, because of course the stories we hear about Xinjiang are not the only stories we're hearing about China, and I think a little comparative perspective will be good on that as well.
Perfect. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Julie. Julie, you were born and raised in Hong Kong and came to the US when you were a teenager, late teenage years. You were educated at the University of San Francisco, Stanford University, UC Hastings College of the Law. You were also the assistant district attorney in San Francisco and then became a judge in San Francisco. You've also co-founded the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and, of course, this organization, Pivot to Peace. And after hearing Daniel and Ken's analysis about Xinjiang and why the sudden interest in the mainstream media about Uyghur human rights, I can't help but notice that the things that came up around the time of the Hong Kong protests that took place in 2019, it's very similar, right? It's like very parallel. And as someone who was born and raised in Hong Kong and follows Hong Kong policy and politics closely, can you share with us your perspective and examination of the 2019 Hong Kong riots and how that relates to this narrative of Xinjiang?
Thank you, Sheila. And I wanted to tell Daniel Dumbrio what an honor and privilege it is to have you on our Pivot to Peace panel, along with fellow Pivot to Peace co-founder Sheila Shao and Professor Ken Hammond. And you're right, Sheila, 2019 was a year of political awakening for me. Hong Kong was under attack. It started as a peaceful protest against an extradition treaty. The treaty proposed by Hong Kong Governor Carrie Lam would allow Hong Kong to extradite a confessed murderer to Taiwan to face murder charges of his pregnant girlfriend, a crime that happened while the couple was vacationing in Taiwan. The victim's parents have been petitioning for justice for their daughter and her unborn child. But somehow the rumor that this bill was a plot to extradite anyone into China caught on. It became a rallying cry for a demonstration against the Hong Kong government. In the end, the bill was withdrawn. The dead victim would not have justice. The confessed murderer walked out of jail and is today still a free man. The attempted extradition of a confessed murderer fell victim to a geopolitical game of big power, big money, and big politics. In these scenarios, the little people always lose. The demonstrations quickly devolved into a riot. For the next 5 months, Hong Kong became a mob scene, carried out by mainly young people, some as young as 11 years old. But this was not just any protest. Behind this inertia was a shadow power imbued with unlimited money, resources, and a plan. As we later learned, the US National Endowment for Democracy, also known as CIA, and the UK played a significant role in this demonstration. Their reason? To destabilize China. The protesters call themselves a leaderless movement. The so-called leaderless mob wreaked havoc upon Hong Kong with youthful impulse and rage. They threw Molotov cocktails at police officers and passerbys. They smashed into public buildings, struck at infrastructures, public transportation, and utilities. They committed random physical assaults against people who disagreed with them. And a 70-year-old man who was arguing with the protesters was killed by a brick thrown at his head. A construction worker was doused with gasoline and his body lit up by a match. He suffered 4-degree burns, spent almost a year in the hospital, and is permanently injured. Actress Celine Ma was taking pictures of the destructive acts of the mob and got clobbered by a group of young people who beat her up. She was rescued by an Australian reporter who was later harassed and doxxed by the protesters online. Thousands of protesters forced the airport to shut down all flights for several days, creating chaos and melee to travelers. A reporter from China was tied up in plastic wires and tortured for hours at the Hong Kong airport until he was rescued. A police officer had a finger bitten off by a protester. The Polytechnic University was trashed and seized from the school authorities and used as an arsenal manufacturing and storage facility. Thousands of Molotov cocktails were found on campus after all intruders were peacefully evacuated from the campus. The Hong Kong legislative chambers were broken into, where protesters started to rampage and damaged, trashed, and removed official documents from the chambers, much like what happened to the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021, except the force and rage used by the Hong Kong protesters were more intense and more uncontrollable. Still, the police kept the restraint. The 2019 riot was called Black Terror by Hong Kong people after the black-clad protesters who felt they could do anything violent in Hong Kong with no holds barred. They destroyed 98% of the pay machines at the subway stations. Repairs were made every night when the rioters went home. Police officers could not keep up with the melee. The much respected and admired Hong Kong police force was branded as public enemy number one. Hong Kong suffered human loss and millions of dollars in property damages. Businesses suffered. The economy was in shambles. The protesters threatened to self-destroy. That said, that would take Hong Kong with them. The destructions persisted even after the extradition bill was withdrawn. What caused these Hong Kong people to seek such self-destruction? Was their freedom and liberty really at stake under China's sovereignty? If so, how do you explain 93% of the Chinese people living in China rated the Chinese government favorably, according to a Harvard University poll? In 2019, Hong Kong ranked among the top 3 cities that enjoyed the most human rights and economic freedoms in the world, according to the Fraser's Human Rights Freedom Index. Hong Kong had enjoyed that ranking for the last 25 years, and 21 of those years were under Chinese sovereignty. Hong Kong enjoyed more human rights and freedom than Americans, which ranked number 15 on the same index. Under the one country, two system rule, China maintained sovereignty over Hong Kong, but allows Hong Kong to keep an autonomous governance with capitalist system as opposed to a socialist system in China. Hong Kong has a general public election system that their former British colonizers did not allow them to have, and a limited one only a few years before the turnover. But the Western world keeps portraying Hong Kong as being oppressed with no freedom. It wasn't too hard for some of the people in Hong Kong to buy into that kind of concept. For the longest time, as colonial subjects, Hong Kong people were oppressed by the British, which maintained a tight grip on Hong Kong's people through a British-dominated political, economic, and social structure. Hong Kong people were made to feel like an inferior people to the British. As people learned from the oppressors, many Hong Kong Chinese took a superior attitude to the Chinese in the mainland, who were poor compared to Hong Kong during the colonial days. Hong Kong people looked down on the Chinese in the mainland because of poverty and perceived backwardness. China was very poor in the 50s and the 70s. The Chinese were struggling with a new society without any resource or support from the outside world. But China is not the same anymore. Even though China is just across the border, many Hong Kong Chinese have never stepped foot into China. If they did, they would find out today China is no longer the China in the 50s or the 70s. It is a liberated society that regards people's life and society and welfare as its top priority. China successfully lifted 800 million people to middle-class status on par with Western standards, and in 2020 reached the goal of eliminating extreme poverty in China. It is the first country to adopt a carbon neutral pledge for 2060. first country to implement a digital monetary system that protects consumers. And in 2020, China owns its first version of the GPS, Beidou, a global navigation system. And let's not forget, China is the first country to end the pandemic and restart its economy way ahead of any country in the world. China offers exciting business and employment opportunities for Hong Kong's young people. Unfortunately, the protesters failed to see these opportunities. They rather buy into the Western ideals of freedom and democracy. That in practical terms is not always what it says it is. Throughout the riots, there were very little, if any at all, open discussion and intelligent discourse about the kind of society that the people wanted and how they feel a Western electoral system would work in Hong Kong. The demands made by the leaderless movement did not even consider people's welfare or livelihoods and their relationship to governance. They make demands for freedom and democracy without identifying what that means for the ordinary people in his or her everyday pursuit of a livelihood for peace and prosperity. They rely on slogans and empty words and gender emotions that turn into rage, that turn into violence. I think that was one of the biggest failings of this so-called movement for democracy. But Hong Kong was the perfect place for the United States and the Western countries to contain China. Hong Kong is a major seaport to the West. It has a rich reservoir of business and financial resources. Breaking it up from China would deal a huge blow to China politically and economically. But what is in it for the people of Hong Kong? These issues were never addressed in the riots. What matters is that there were powerful forces in the US and Western society that propagated the idea that Hong Kong has no freedom and that Hong Kong must depend on the West, the UK, the United States, to be free and to have democracy. Nuri Vitachi, author of The Other Side of Hong Kong, A Secret War in Hong Kong, documented funding from the CIA to support anti-government activities in Hong Kong. He said Hong Kong protesters get paid for protesting, and some received training in practical street protest strategy and media control from members of the professional revolution industry, which is US and West society funded since January 2013. He named US-funded foundations as being directly involved with Hong Kong's 2019 riots. Net's own website listed 170 million Hong Kong dollars has been sent to Hong Kong on mainland since 2014 to fund the cause of democracy. But these are not free money. The protesters were carrying out a job for these entities. Where we are today is that the 2019 riots failed. It doesn't mean that there are no little signs of unrest. After all, the US is considering a law to appropriate $300 million to support anti-China propaganda throughout the world. But for now, there are signs of peace in Hong Kong. China passed the National Security Act. Now that law would penalize people who commit terrorism, sedition, and secession against the Hong Kong government. This law directly addresses the power and influence behind the riots. It would not permit foreign intrusion and intervention to promote separatism in Hong Kong. We saw the city quiet down. Things were getting back to normal. Hong Kong is picking up the pieces and reinvigorating itself. We see life and prosperity returning. But for passing such a law that protected Hong Kong from foreign intrusion, the US sanctioned 11 of Hong Kong's leaders, including the governor, the chief of police, for, I quote, undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of Hong Kong citizens. As a native of Hong Kong, I was greatly shaken by the violence that overtook Hong Kong and what I learned about these riots, and I'm more committed to peace than ever. We saw Hong Kong as slice of the upheavals when the US and foreign countries fund riots and promote disharmony in foreign lands. What would happen to the world if US and China go to full-scale war? The Nation's magazine recently stated, and I quote, "It is increasingly clear that Washington is pushing China hard. challenging its position big time and often in a military fashion. And you don't want to know what sort of warfare this country's military leaders are now imagining there, unquote. Pivot to Peace has been imagining what kind of warfare our military leaders are thinking, and it is not pretty. We don't want to sound alarmist, but given the history of our country's never-ending wars, we know war is a possibility. But this time, the target of our war is China, a formidable opponent with a strong military power, a nuclear potential country. And the price the world would pay for this war would be calamitous. We have a small window of space now to urge for rational thinking. Given all the tensions between the US and China, even a small token of a peaceful gesture from our political leaders to China will go a long way to avoid war. China does not want war. They have made that very clear. They also don't want to take US #1 super status in the world. They just wanted to take care of their own people. Why can't we do the same? We said we will do it, but we don't. Our continuing confrontation with China will lead us to war. Pivot to Peace urges our country's political leadership to work towards cooperation with China, not confrontation. Aim for peace and not war. And remember, China is not our enemy. Thank you so much for watching our webinar.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you for going through the accounts of what happened in Hong Kong, what resources these Hong Kong protesters had, who was behind it, as well as just going through the accomplishments and policies that China has made over the years. And again, this is information that many, many Americans have very little knowledge about because all of the headlines are dominated by demonizing, sensationalized headlines. You and Daniel also both touched on the fact that China really doesn't want world domination, but in fact, peaceful coexistence. And the truth is, it will defend itself if the US turns this Cold War into a hot war. And we can agree here that no one on this planet wants that, maybe except for the people who are engineering this war. I wanted to turn to Daniel for a final question, which is after hearing Ken speak and after hearing Julie speak about Hong Kong and just everything in the context, what is your perspective on what's happening in Xinjiang?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, that was a great talk on Hong Kong, Julie, and the I really like focusing on the fact that there were people killed. There was a person killed, a street cleaner. There was somebody lit on fire, and these were by the protesters. A lot of people in the West don't know this. A lot of people, and I have conversations regularly, they're like, "Really? I don't believe it." And you send them the details, and they're just kind of blown away by it. I think the other point too is looking at the study showing that Hong Kong was the third freest place on earth while this was going on, and number 17, the US was coming to try to save Hong Kong, which is absurd. I mean, and we're talking about measurable, tangible freedoms. And I think the US knew that there was a real risk that by pushing this and encouraging this, that they'd leave the Hong Kong protesters worse off than when they started out, with national security laws having to be implemented and pushed through, but they were willing to take that risk and sacrifice the people they were pretending to care about on the remote chance that they could spark a color revolution, which would spread across the border and generally disrupt China. And I think, there's a lot of stuff that's going on with Hong Kong failing. I think, the next push is Xinjiang. And to answer your question more specifically about what China was, what's going on in Xinjiang, China was dealing with a really severe terrorism problem and the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, which is important to note also that it was a deliberately twisted interpretation of Islam. And I think this is the problem that China's been facing too. They wanted to address this issue without spreading Islamophobia. You see evidence of them trying really hard to prevent this from spreading, which was really different from what happened after 9/11, in the US, where people could say whatever they wanted, that there were Muslims on top of buildings celebrating what had happened, and all these other fake stories that led to a huge backlash on the Muslim population. Even a Sikh man in a gas station was killed. Mosques were burnt, attacked with fire attacks and things like that. So it's a really difficult situation to talk about without getting people mixed up about this. But there was the real Islamic fundamentalism issue. And, in terms of the physical attacks that these groups performed, there were thousands, and not only Han Chinese were targeted. Uyghurs who worked as public service workers, or who didn't follow their strict interpretation of Islam, or who drank, even though the culture of winemaking and drinking in Uyghur society predates even that of the introduction of Islam, which is, these people would be targeted. And that's worth thinking about if cultural genocide is something people think the Chinese government was doing, and if they're really concerned about this topic. That was a piece of their culture that was being eliminated by these groups. But so the situation on the ground, full-on terrorists were, of course, just outright arrested. But those who seem to be connected to these movements or began forcing their religious beliefs on others, or were caught with extremist materials, were put through vocational training programs to improve their abilities and find opportunities to participate in society and better themselves. There are many studies from the World Bank Development and Research Group also that shows unemployment and a lack of opportunity is the perfect breeding ground for extremism, and especially when you combine that with the fact that a group is being specifically targeted for radicalization. So China's approach was quite different from from Western countries. In England, if you're caught with extremist material linked to banned groups, you go to jail, just like Benjamin Hammond recently did in the UK after he was caught with material from a banned Nazi group. China's method is also, of course, most certainly better than America's solution to suspected terrorists abroad, who are not only not given the chance to reform, they're not given a trial, but they're simply executed on the spot, either by military forces on the ground or by drone strikes controlled by someone thousands of miles away. I don't believe these vocational training programs are perfect. I spoke about it in some of my videos. I think there are probably issues that could be found, but we're not being given an honest narrative by the West, which is, currently being propped up and funded with millions of dollars in US government funding, and with testimonies coming from people who continually change their stories. It's created an environment where it's difficult to get two sides to come together and talk about this in an honest way in this kind of an environment. But now we're just supposed to, we're expected to believe that a full-scale genocide is going on with no refugee crisis on its borders, and think about that for a moment. People often say, because I've interacted with people on this point, they say, well, it's because they're on lockdown. Yet the Uyghur testimonies are coming from people, once again, who left the country on their passports legally. So while everyday ordinary Uyghurs can't leave China, apparently the Uyghurs who were beaten and tortured and who were supposed to be genocided were granted passports to head out and tell the world about their story. And some of them, not taking enough care when crafting their stories, apparently had their passports renewed while they were under arrest, as I mentioned earlier. For those who don't believe, and I know there's many people who believe this, don't believe there's any significant credible threat of terrorism from radicalized groups in Xinjiang, just take a look at what the well over 10,000 Uyghur militants fighting with ISIS and other terror groups in Syria do. Look at what they do to the towns they managed to take over. Have a talk with a Syrian whose hometown was captured about what it's like to live under their version of Sharia law. What happens to them if they loosely identify as Muslim but don't go to pray on Fridays? Or worse, what happens if they're a Christian Syrian? You'll have to dig a bit, though, because these are stories that don't paint America's so-called moderate rebels in a positive light, to say the least. But when you find these stories on your own, you'll get a bigger picture of what China has successfully defeated, and tie in the bigger picture to understand, okay, what's really going on in Xinjiang in terms of the actual efforts that were taken and what exactly was being fought against.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. I think that was honestly an excellent way to end this discussion, and just again imploring the audience to think critically about these questions that are coming up and think critically about the narratives that are coming up. But with that being said, we are unfortunately wrapping up this discussion today. I think we could talk about this for hours, honestly. Thank you again so much to Daniel, to Ken, to Julie, from all corners of the world, for sharing your expertise and your knowledge around this highly debated issue as US-China tensions really continue to rise. This panel discussion has very clearly painted a picture that situates Xinjiang at the center of an all-out propaganda and military-driven campaign to further demonize China. And we should not be naive to this, because we've seen this exact tactic, literally the same handbook, employed to justify military intervention in many events in the past. And what we're seeing is the US government and the corporate-owned media weaponizing, honestly, the hearts and minds of well-meaning people, just like Ken said, to continue this destructive path of confrontation with China. And in the end, major power conflict is the ultimate catastrophe for humanity. And it is our job as people of conscience to demand peace and cooperation instead of war and confrontation. And this is what Pivot to Peace is fighting for. And if you found this webinar interesting and educational, if you were a skeptic and still are not convinced, but still found this interesting, we do ask that you do 3 things for us. One is to share this webinar to your friends and family and on your social media, especially to those who are eager to better understand what's happening in Xinjiang. 2, to consider donating to Pivot to Peace at peacepivot.org. And we are an entirely grassroots organization and need the support of our followers to continue to build this movement towards global peace. And 3, to sign our mission statement at peacepivot.org/mission. And Pivot to Peace's mission is to provide a space and platform for those throughout US society who are deeply concerned by the new US military and foreign policy doctrine that puts this country on the course of major power conflict. And if you are not already receiving emails, of course, you can sign up on our website, as well as follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at peacepivot. Thank you again for spending this time with us. And again, thank you so much to our speakers for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.